In our Ask Mixing with Mike section, I have a question here that's come up recently. It's like, how important is it, or is it important to reference my mixes in mono? And this is something that used to be a huge part of studio mixing and working with audio. And the primary reasons for referencing your mixes in mono is because of compatibility with mono audio sources. So, what is mono? In terms of, just because you have two speakers, does that mean that you actually have stereo? And a lot of it does kind of depend. See, historically, a lot of stuff transmitted in radio, would come through mono, and we didn't really have stereo mixes until, well, it didn't really. It came into existence, in the 50s, but really didn't get used until the 60s. So late 50s into the early 60s, where they started making stereo recordings, and the technology for it on vinyl became available. And then all of a sudden, you had to have stereo systems so people could listen in stereo. So mono was a real big thing. And even for years, AM radio transmission here in the US was all in mono. And then the FM transmission was stereo. So you had to have some kind of mono compatibility to think about. The other thing to think about in terms of mono compatibility that's sort of outside of the box, because while most things are in stereo, even a transmission coming through the speakers in a TV, no matter how big, if you're 10 feet away from it, essentially is effectively mono. So the farther you are away from the source, the more it starts to mono up or become closer together. That's not really an issue. Where the mono compatibility comes in more is when one of those sides is missing or not there. And this is where the mono compatibility issue kind of plays a little bit more of a factor. So generally, when you're mixing, the referencing to mono, what's going to happen is the center signal is going to double in volume, and those signals on the side will half in volume, or the relative differential between the two becomes a double and a half. So anything that's panned hard left or hard right will end up being half as loud when in mono, and whatever's in the center, like a vocal or a kick drum or a snare drum, is going to be twice as loud. So there's a reason why certain things are always mixed center, and primarily the most important instruments in a mix are mixed center. Now, what happens is that when you pan things left or hard left or right, typically it's because they're balanced with the same instrument, like a doubling or some other instrument that's very similar. So even if you had an electric and an acoustic guitar and you pan them hard left and right, or pan them left and right, if you lost half of them, the combination of the two of them coming back to mono would still hold together. So where you kind of have to be a little bit cautious is when you take a singular instrument for an extended period of time and you leave it out on one side the whole time. The primary issue being that if, for example, you're in a listening space where, say, and a lot of audio gets played in places like, clothing stores, restaurants, things like that, where they pipe it in stereo, but you may be really close to one speaker and far away from the other side, from the right channel, and a lot of people don't really pay attention to these things. And so all of a sudden you're only getting one side of the mix. And so you would want to have that one side also have vocal represented in it, drums, kick, snare, anything that is part of the mix, a main part of the mix represented in there. So it is kind of this funny thing where you're kind of playing this game and referencing to mono. In that case, you would be just like a left only mix or a right only mix, which would be a little bit different. But in referencing to mono, when it sums together, what happens to the mix? It's kind of like a way of just kind of checking out to see how your mix holds together when different things happen to it, when it gets mangled through the lifestyles and the way that people listen to music and audio. So, in a simple answer, is it important to reference your mixes to mono? Absolutely, it's important to reference your mixes in mono. The best way to do it is not to just have, the easy way to do it is to have like this, the mono button and on your monitoring system so that you feed both sides and it sums together through your normal speakers. The better way to do it is to have a separate speaker. There used to be these great speakers called Auratones, There's a company called Avantone, which basically does the same thing. And it's just a little box cube speaker, which is meant to represent kind of a radio speaker. Having a separate mono speaker is not a bad idea, and something that's limited in frequency response, right? So maybe you're not getting a whole lot below like 200 cycles and not a whole lot above like 4 or 5K. And see if your mix stays together in that as well. Because, in my mind, every mix, every instrument should have a little bit of itself represented in that frequency range from, I would say, probably closer to 400 to 2K, somewhere in there. And almost every instrument has harmonics and other things that exist in there. The reason being is that when you're played on smaller systems, laptop speakers and the like, things from a distance where it's filtered down, can you still hear all the instrumentation in the mix? And can you hear it in mono that way? So it serves a double purpose. So the basic answer to the question is yes, it is important to still reference your mixes to mono. It's really all about how it translates out into the consumer environment. That's really the reason. Nobody is really consciously listening in mono. Okay, they just end up listening in mono because of circumstance. So you want to make sure that you translate. All right, so there's our Ask Mixing with Mike question.